Hi there, welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this, our second of the lectures on Impressionism, we will look at Degas, Cassatt, Rodin, and Claudel. Perhaps one of the other well-known artists of the Impressionist movement was Degas, who had a tremendous ability to capture qualities of movement and action. And it could be said that Monet instigated a profound change in how people looked at landscape, and it was Degas who instigated a major change in the way we look at the figure. And I show you this early picture by Degas because it doesn't really look anything like anything else he did, and yet it seems to have been a very important painting to him. It's quite large, and he began work on it sometime in 1860 to 1862 and continued to work on it. It was listed for the exhibition of the Impressionists in 1880, 20 years later, but there's no evidence it was ever shown, and it remained in his studio at the time of his death. And so we begin with this because I think Edgar Degas, he was enormously prolific, and we have a lot of really excellent work from him. But him as a person, he was a bit of an enigma. And there's lots about him that we may never fully understand as a contradictory man of various impulses. And so when we look at this painting of the young Spartans exercising, we can see this tension between the adolescents in the foreground, parents in the background milling about. There's this sort of vacant space that separates the two. And this tension in the air between this seems to be the point of the picture. But what's really going on here? It's hard to say. Degas was successful as an artist can be. This was his first sold painting, and it's really an absolute wonder. It was a cotton office in New Orleans. He came from a wealthy family that ran a giant cotton operation out of New Orleans, and here's all his family elder men at the office. And it's such an extraordinary and complicated space with all these figures doing all these different things, paper and cotton and receipts and the windows and the glass. There's just this amazing tumult of activity. The black suits beautifully contrast with all this wonderful texture. And this is what Degas could do. I mean, he really could put figures in a complicated space and make it work in a way that few painters would really attempt to create such a work. Here is another wonderful example of Degas, the absinthe drinkers. We remember absinthe we talked about with Manet's first painting he attempted to submit to the Salon. And here we see, again, the way Degas places these figures deep into this environment, these tables that push them back in space, and this lovely green drink sitting before the woman who seems completely out of her mind, and the man who seems to be nursing a hangover. These are the kinds of pictures which so beautifully capture this moment, this quiet, intimate moment, the reflection off the glass behind them. Now, of course, for Degas, he thought this was just hysterical. He knew these two people in the painting, and they were very high-functioning actors and artists. We can also tell that this is early in the morning, the light here. These are not late-night partiers. This is a bit more of the hair of the dog, early morning drinkers. As Degas would say, the provocative thing is to not always show the source of light, but rather its effect. So he gives us this way in which the scene is illuminated from the diffused light of windows, where we get the forms, but we're not dramatically emphasizing light the way Monet would. Here is another obsession of Degas. He loved fashion like Manet. In his later period, Degas really looked at clothing, and he loved patterning. You can see his influence of Japanism on him, the way in which this flat space is punctuated by these repeating patterns, much like you might see in a Rimpa composition. And the woman, her face is so beautifully realized. You could tell without hardly seeing them that she's holding pins in her mouth as she's working this hat. Anyways, it's just a stunning, subtle, elegant picture that Degas could do. And this is something that I find really fascinating about Degas. He's so observant. He's so keyed into these details without overworking them. He would say, think of a treatise on ornament for women or by women based on their manner of observing, of combining, of selecting the fashionable outfits and all things. On a daily basis, they compare more than men 1,000 visible things with one another. And so he seems to be really keyed into a great deal about women, their conditions, and their interests. But people who knew Degas, he was a bit of a sexist. He was a kind of a curmudgeon, a loner, and he was difficult to get along with. And so we see a lot of pictures of bathers, women on their toilet, and these women would hold these poses for an excruciating long period of time while he labored over the surface of their bodies and the light across their forms to create these wonderful, intimate portraits. But there's also something obsessive about it, the way he's arranging this composition. He seems more concerned by the careful placement of things and the movement of the shapes than he really is of the people in his pictures. Very often they are at a distance to us. He's observing them objectively. He's really very clearly objectifying them. And many critics have said you should just, be looking at this painting through a peephole, as there is this sort of voyeurism that comes with Edgar Degas' compositions. Here we see Edgar Degas in another one of his obsessions in his work, which was ballet dancers, these young girls who, in rehearsal, we see them constantly pointing various shapes. And the thing that makes Degas so fascinating here is the way he's cropping the space. He's cutting things off. We see a leg here, an arm there. We see a fraction of a body. And again, the people are made beautiful by the way in which he is such a master of placing the figure in the space in these dramatic off-center compositions. Here again, off-center compositions, they are the ballerinas preparing to go on stage. We see them in rehearsal, we see them off stage, but we rarely see them performing as such. And so there's this kind of voyeurism that was very big in ukiyo-e. Remember those pictures in Japan of the floating world, where they're often showing the geisha not in their performance mode, but, when they were caught off guard, when they're in their private studios rehearsing. And this is the kind of thing that Degas was also interested in. Now, perhaps one of his most famous pieces is actually not even a painting. And it's a work that really was quite scandalous in the time, that if we look at it today, we're probably thinking more about, how charming and delightful it might look like. The Little Dancer sculpture was put on exhibition in Paris in 1881, and it was an absolute shock, such that it had to be taken out of the exhibition. People were really offended by this. They described it a flower of precocious depravity. Now, what are people responding to here? Why were people so upset by seeing the sculpture? Well, for one, it's very realistic in that it shows us one of these ballerina dancers, not in an ideal way in performance, but it's actually one of the girls who make up the chorus of the ballet, who are these younger girls who come from poor families, and this is just one of the few ways they might get ahead in life. Most of them, as they grew older, would never become great ballerinas, but they would end up going into prostitution, and if they got pregnant, they would become a laundress. There really wasn't a great life. They were the outcast and the downtrodden. I don't believe Degas was really keyed into this as a social statement. He wasn't trying to celebrate their artistry. I think in all due respects, I think he simply thought them quite fascinating in their shapes and their forms in a very formal way. And so he was really quite taken aback by the incredible outcry against this sculpture. And people, were really shocked by it in that this sort of rampant public disapproval. They thought they'd seen something really that was not meant to be shown that way. Now, we look at this sculpture here, you'll notice that the tutu that she is wearing is quite shoddy, and the ribbon behind her back is also quite faded. This is what happens to those kinds of materials over time. And people who own these sculptures or copies of these sculptures that are now cast in bronze are either deciding that it's better to allow the material to age, to show the actual age of that material, or in some cases, people have decided that it's better to restore and maintain the illusion that this is what it looked like. This is what the artists intended this piece to look like. The other great impressionist that we know much about is Mary Cassatt, the American who came to Paris to escape the provincial American environment and gain some notoriety for a more experimental impressionist paintings. She and Berthe Morisot were great friends, but Mary Cassatt also got along quite well with Degas, whereas many people did not. They would eventually have a falling out, but for many years, Degas and Cassatt worked together. Degas was the one who invited her to participate in the Impressionist show of 1879. So, overcoming her father's objections, she moves to Paris in 1866 at age 22. This painting here at the Opera from 1878 is just a wonderful picture of this woman in the foreground looking through her opera glasses, and she's, studying the performers on stage. Well, if you follow the curvature of the balcony that she is on, you'll see this man leaning over the balcony and with his opera glass staring right at us. It's as if the audacity of this man, that he is, of course, more concerned with who's in the opera box than he is with what's on stage. But it speaks to the kind of privilege that men had, that this kind of obvious behavior, this willingness to just stare at people because that's what they're interested in, is something that the woman in her defined space would never do. And so, like Berthe Morisot, we see in Mary Cassatt the kind of intimate world of young women, girls, mothers. And her technique was something that was really impressive. She really captures a wonderful, bright, clearly defined forms that speak to the moment. So she really has that Degas-like figures in space. And her looseness is not quite so much as Berthe Morisot, but she's trying to convey a bit more of the glances and the interaction between the figures. Here's a lovely picture, a pastel drawing of a young woman in a black and green bonnet. And again, the Japanese use of shape and form to define the figure, and the way in which fashion becomes an important part of how the figures understood is the way Mary Cassatt just really mastered color in a very exciting way. And again, her work goes very far into the Japanese style. She really has a whole series of paintings and dry point aquatint, soft ground etchings that are created with that flatness in mind, the use of ornament and decoration across the surface in a really elegant way. And again, people identified both the idea of the Japanese and this quality of feminine life and feminine roles through Impressionism. Now, a really fascinating Italian artist, Medardo Rosso, would explore this idea of Impressionism in sculpture. His forms were often made of plaster or wax or various materials. He wasn't so concerned with making finished work, but he loved to create sculptures that he could then light in various ways and then photograph them. It was almost as if the light experiments he wanted to perform on these sculptures was more important to him than the objects themselves. He wanted to control the light. He wanted to create a very particular kind of experience. And we have lots of photographs that he made of his work in these various stages. There was a lovely exhibition of his work at the Pulitzer Museum in St. Louis, where they gave you an opportunity. They would put his sculpture in a room and you could turn various knobs and experiment like he did with lighting the object in numerous ways. And it was really a fascinating exploration of sculpture taken in a completely new direction. The man who's often associated with the creation of modern sculpture in Europe was Auguste Rodin. He was enormously influential, a complete master sculptor, and he really pushed the boundaries to break out of the neoclassical stigma, which had held on to sculpture much longer than it had in painting. Partly because sculpture relies on large commissions, it's very expensive, and the tastes of the people who were coordinating and providing those opportunities to create large-scale sculptures were very conservative, and they held more tightly to the ideas of the past. So to come out with new kinds of sculpture was really a remarkable achievement. Now, here's one of the early pieces by Rodin. And instead of showing us this idealized face, he's showing us a man with a broken nose. Now, you can see how he's provided this back of the sculpture has broken off in this sheared way. And again, it adds to the fractured and broken quality of the sculpture. Apparently, this was all a part of an accident. When he was working on the model, it fell off its stand and the back of the head shattered. He didn't have time to repair it. He liked the open back, and so instead it became a mask instead of a bust. The sculpture that really made a big name for Rodin was the Bronze Age, which was this absolutely exquisitely rendered in a realistic fashion, and to such a degree that many people accused him of cheating and not actually sculpting it himself, but using plaster molds of a model to create the sculpture. He was so incensed by this accusation that he did a public demonstration where he could show that he could do this sculpture in public. And that performance is what really made his name. He was able to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that he was indeed the artist of exceptional skill in realism. But to him, it also meant that he would never again try for absolute realism. He would always want to demonstrate that this is indeed a sculpture by putting and leaving fingerprints and marks or flaws that could have been fixed. He wanted it to remain and appear like a forged, sculpted object. And this only enhanced the modernist qualities of his work. Perhaps his most famous work you see here is The Gates of Hell, a commission he received. He won in 1880 to create a portal for a planned museum of decorative arts. Rodin dedicated much of the next 4 decades to this elaborate Gates of Hell. Now, he became a sketchbook for ideas. He would add to it, he would change it, he would take things from other projects and put them in here. He worked consistently to reimagine this really extraordinary sculpture. Now, the one casting you can find in Paris at the Musée Rodin, and another one, if you are in the Bay Area, at the Cantor Museum at Stanford University in California. There is a beautiful casting of The Gates of Hell outside. And it really is, they have a tremendous collection of Rodin sculptures there. It's really well worth the visit if you're ever in that area. Now, you'll see in the place of honor right at the very center of this Gates of Hell, he's placed one of his most famous sculptures, the Thinker. Let's look at the Thinker here, which is, again, what makes this such an extraordinary statue is that even though it feels so well known and so kind of obvious, the way he puts the elbow across the body, turning it, the tensions in the musculature makes this figure feel wrought. An internal debate is happening through the flexing of all these muscles on the exterior. A close-up of the Gates of Hell, we can just see how all these figures tumbled in and out of this undulating space. Here we see the sculpture that is also on the very top of the Gates of Hell, the 3 Shades. Notice how he's basically taken the same figure and then reproduced it. And this is one of the things that Rodin began to experiment with, which is the way multiples can be made to interact and create a really interesting and dynamic form where we can sense and feel the tension of the figures reflected in the spaces that they create between their various poses. Another very famous piece that is also available on view at the Stanford Museum is the Burghers of Calais. You can see here this extraordinary series of figures that are the burghers who have willingly sacrificed their lives so that their city may be released from a brutal siege when they were under attack. And so here they are, rather than seeing them in this heroic poses, standing in a stalwart way, we see them moving and they're on our level, and we are given a way to see them in this intimate way as they come to terms with this decision to sacrifice themselves. And so really powerful piece. And as I said, if you're at the university at Stanford, here is what it looks like to do them as they were intended to be seen. Now, when Rodin proposed this idea that you could walk amongst them, the people of the town who wanted to commemorate them said, no, we want to put them up high on a pedestal, which is what they eventually did. But to Rodin, it was much more important that we really interact with these figures on their level. Now, Rodin began to work with a young woman, Camille Claudel, around 1884. She became a huge source of inspiration for him and acted as a model, a confidant, and a lover. She never lived with Rodin, who was married in a 20-year relationship at this time, but she was absolutely smitten by his work. And she herself, as we see her, the mermaid or the flute player, we see was an absolutely tremendous artist. Rodin relied on her almost to a fault, where he had her do all of the hands that he needed for his sculpture. She was so much better and faster at making hands than he was. And their relationship was very unequal. Rodin relied on her, but he did not promote her. He did not encourage her own independence, and instead he would eventually go back to his wife, refused to acknowledge or validate their relationship. Here we see his sculpture of her and then her sculpture of him. People are now looking at the extraordinary expressive power of Camille Claudel's work. She seems to be willing to go into a realm of emotion and passion to a degree that Rodin seems much more conservative and restrained. Here is another one of Camille Claudel's work. We see this wonderful gesture, the way the figures are enveloped in this watery wave, this intimate movement between them, wonderful turning of the figures in this very elegant way. As her relationship with Rodin became more and more problematic, she created a sculpture called The Mature Age, showing this young girl being left behind while this other man accepts the accolades of victory and marches on into the future. And that was too much for Rodin. He cut her off and refused to any more contact with her. And after 1905, Claudel appeared to be mentally ill. She destroyed many of her statues. She disappeared for long periods of time, exhibited signs of paranoia, and was diagnosed with having schizophrenia. She accused Rodin of stealing her ideas and leading a conspiracy to kill her. On March 10th, 1913, at the initiative of her brother, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. For a while, the press accused her family of committing a sculpture of her genius. Her mother forbade her to receive mail from anyone other than her brother. The hospital staff regularly proposed to her family that Claudel be released, but her mother adamantly refused each time. And so Camille Claudel ended her life and spent 30 years in a psychiatric hospital. Paul Claudel, her brother, visited his sister only 7 times in that 30-year span.